Hey everybody, Pastor James here. Good to see you again on this Sunday night as we continue in our YouTube and Facebook video series about how to effectively minister to the different generations that are in our culture, in our society, and in the neighborhoods even surrounding our church building here in Austin, Texas. It's great to have you along for the ride tonight. So, this evening we're going to talk about the generation called simply Generation X. Now, this is my generation. This was the group of people who were born between 1965 and 1981. I'm sort of later on the Generation X spectrum, but definitely fit into that to that group. I have a strong affinity for Generation Xers, and hope that you can get a sense of that even tonight. But we're going to talk about the traits of Generation X and what makes up this cultural group to whom we must minister and we're called to minister. And we're also going to talk about some ways that we can effectively reach out to and connect with people in the Generation X group or society or culture. So again, these were the folks who were born between 1965 and 1981. And the Generation X group is often referred to as the middle child these days. And if you are a middle child, you know what that means, right? You've got an older sibling, the baby boomers, you have a younger sibling, the millennials, and you feel kind of stuck in the middle. This has been a mantra of the of the Generation X group really since the beginning of this generation. But I wanted to point out here on the slide and the information here that there are two songs that really capture the heart and the soul of Generation X. One is a song, and I would highly recommend you look these up, look at the lyrics of them. But one's called Waiting on the World to Change. This is a John Mayer song. And if a Generation Xer Gen Xer hears that song, they'll kind of perk up and go, that's right. That's kind of what I'm feeling like. And also another song that sort of captures the spirit of Generation X is a song by Nirvana called All Apologies, and it simply talks about the feeling of worthlessness and fear that a lot of Gen Xers carry with them each and every day, a sense of angst and anxiety, and also carrying this weight of thinking that a lot in our society is due to us. We feel like things are our fault and we've got to fix them. And so if you look at those two songs, that gives you kind of a spirit of the age um, for what Generation Xers deal with. In fact, in 1991, we traced the moniker Generation X back to some journal articles and other sociological things that were happening back in the early 90s. And Generation X was referred to at that time as really the lost generation. We don't know what to call them. They're just Generation X. So you can see how encouraging that was to a whole generation of kids in the United States at that time being told, we don't know what to do with you. So that's where the moniker came from, and continued to lead into a little bit of skepticism in Generation X. So some traits about this generation. You're going to see Gen Xers push back against defining professional career and work as what it means to be successful. In fact, Generation Xers are much more concerned about their families and child rearing and the circle of friends that we have, much more than the career path that we're on. Work is still very, very important, don't get me wrong, but we saw how, especially in the 70s and 80s, how the baby boomers really glommed on to success in the workplace as the defining mark of what it means to be a successful person. And most Gen Xers, again, we're talking in broad terms, but most Gen Xers have pushed back against that and said, well, work is very important. Um, we don't want to be defined by our career. We want to be much more defined by how we treat other people and our families and that sort of thing. Major events that happened during the formative years, really, of Generation X. We saw the HIV and the AIDS crisis come about. And we saw who took the blame for that. And there was mass hysteria and mass panic about that. It was a scary time, if you remember back in those days. We knew a lot less than we know today about HIV and AIDS, and that was a particularly scary time for Gen Xers especially. We also recall the presidencies of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and how different those time frames and cultures were, and the impact on our society. One of the most defining moments for a Gen Xer is in 1986 when the Challenger, the space shuttle, blew up. And that particularly led to a sense of skepticism about our leadership, about politics, and about the cost of putting too much confidence in ourselves. We saw a space shuttle blow up on live television, and that was a defining mark for the Generation X. Also, we saw the fall of the Soviet Union. Our millennial friends have only read about that, but we experienced that. We saw the Berlin Wall fall. I remember the night that the news broke about that, and watching our German brothers and sisters breaking the wall down with their pickaxes and hammers. And it was a very emotional experience. We saw the fall of communism and the fall of socialism. So a lot of Generation Xers are going to push back against socialism and communism, because we've seen what that has done, and we see what freedom looks like when walls get torn down. So we're a little skeptical of the recent resurgence that we've seen in our society towards socialism and democratic socialism. We sort of are a little bit skeptical about that. We also have watched the fall of a president in Bill Clinton and the whole Monica Lewinsky thing, which added to our sense of skepticism about leaders in the world. And we also experienced not the Gulf War, well, we did experience the Gulf War in the early 2000s, but we saw how all of that began to take shape in the early 90s when Saddam Hussein made a move on Kuwait and we intervened and interfered. And the reverberations of that is still happening today. You also saw in the formative years of Generation X major popular culture shifts, or shifts in our culture. We saw the advent of MTV. They actually did play music back in the day. It's a lot different today than what it was when I was a kid. We had a lot more music videos on MTV, and there was a shift away from regular terrestrial radio and a shift towards television being a major outlet for our entertainment. So MTV came into the spotlight. We also shifted a great deal in pop music and what that meant. From the early 80s, late 70s, you had disco all the way to the sort of bubblegum pop of the 80s. And then our generation really took the reins with grunge and heavy metal, and all of that came in the late 80s and early 90s. That was a defining shift in the culture for our generation. And wearing the plaid shirts and the pants with the holes in them and all that stuff. That was us. We were the middle child, and we were skeptical about everything, right? We were just pushing back against the man and all that stuff. Also, you saw alternative forms of media come to the spotlight. We were really the first video game generation, and the first generation that really used computers in a personal way, the personal computer that you had at home. Now, it's nothing like the computers we have today, nothing like the one that I'm recording this video on, but nonetheless, we were the first generation to experience that major shift in computers coming from the workplace to actually invading our homes, and we can use them at home. But some of these sources of media and music and everything was beginning to, again, express an angst and a skepticism even against the baby boomer generation. So these are some major traits of Generation X. Some other traits here about this generation. Gen Xers oftentimes see themselves as fiercely independent and also highly adaptive. Before the moniker Gen X, we were called the latchkey kid generation. In other words, we grew up in households where the majority of which are both of our parents worked, and our other siblings, we were usually the older siblings, so we had to take care of our brothers and sisters and had to become highly adaptive. We were not at school all the time, so after school, what did you do? Well, we hung out with friends, we went home, we had to make our own supper and our own meals. We had to take care of our brothers and sisters. So our generation essentially grew up very quickly in taking more of a parental role very early on in our lives. So we see ourselves as fiercely independent. We've got this. We'll take care of it. We've been here before, and we also feel highly adaptive. There's not one way to skin a cat with a Gen Xer. You can do a lot of things, and creativity is very, very welcome in this generation. Oftentimes, we also, as Gen Xers, view skeptically our older brothers and sisters, the baby boomers, and also our younger brothers and sisters, the millennials. For the most part, now again, we're talking in big brush terms here, all right, painting with a big brush. What we're saying here is that oftentimes us Gen Xers, the middle kids, look at our siblings in the other cultural groups and generational groups as rather selfish and entitled. Yet we also see the great potential. We're grateful for the baby boomers, especially for their advocacy of equality of different racial groups, and also we see in our millennial friends a great deal of potential to change the world and to make it a better place. Sometimes we just don't like the way they go about it, which that's very normal for any generational group. But you're going to find in Gen Xers a real skepticism of other generations. Also, among Gen Xers, you're going to see that oftentimes they are filled with a great fear of failure. They come into the workplace thinking, well, how am I going to mess this up? How am I going to destroy this place? And don't really, even though we're very creative, very independent, and are very responsible people, oftentimes there's a great fear that we're going to mess everything up. In fact, ours is the generation that has made it a little more mainstream to accept flaws, even great flaws in other people. Our generation was the first to really invent what's called reality TV. Now, how realistic is it? Let's be honest, it probably is not. It's probably all scripted. But even in the early days, you remember the Real World show on MTV, that sort of thing. It was a celebration of character flaws. There weren't perfect people selling perfect products on television anymore. It was all about imperfection and people being authentic. More about that word in just a minute. Also in this generation, another trait would be that close family and friends, the very close-knit group, are often seen as more important and dependable than even cultural leaders, than even government. Sometimes you're going to find even a more libertarian sort of view of government among Generation Xers. We have a hard time sort of glomming on to certain candidates for political office. We're more concerned about, hey, what's happening at the local level with our friends and with our family, and there's a real pushback against political authority. Also, we're very concerned about parenting. Obviously, this is a reaction, I think, to the fact that many of our parents in our generation were very busy in the workplace, and sometimes we felt a little left out. So we don't want that experience to happen for our kids. So you see a great concern with parenting, and also this real pushback against like the 1950s and 60s parent who, dad was at work and mom took care of the home and all of that. So some of the roles have shifted to where both dads and mom, there's a more egalitarian perspective among Generation Xers when it comes to the home and child rearing. We're also passionate about equality, just like our parents were. How can we make sure that everybody has an equal say and equal input, especially in our families and in the workplace? There's a strong work ethic as well in Generation X. We picked that up from our parents, and also we are great admirers of our grandparents and the way that they handled themselves during the Depression and during World War II. And so we saw that strong work ethic and apply that to our lives. However, you'll see in Generation X the beginning of this thing that's even very popular today, where we'll try out many jobs and many careers. You'll see Generation Xers stay in a workplace for just a few years and then maybe transition and try out something else. Doesn't mean that they're not committed, doesn't mean that they don't have a strong work ethic. You'll see a strong work ethic. But Generation Xers are also more concerned about trying on a lot of hats, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Also, we see in the Generation X, especially in the workplace, that they work within the institutional boundaries. However, they're going to advocate very patiently and very persistently for a change. We're a little bit different than our baby boomer fathers and mothers who stuck in one career for many years and worked within the institutional bounds and created the hierarchy and the hierarchical systems in the workplace. But we'll work within those boundaries, but we'll advocate very patiently for change, not try to change everything at once, but advocate over time. And again, we're talking in generalities here, but these are the traits mostly of the Generation Xer. Now, how then do we minister to and with Gen Xers in the church and in our community? Well, here are a few pointers that I would advocate for our church and any other church who's looking to make inroads with Gen Xers around them. First of all, it's a good point to say don't box them in. Let Gen Xers try on a lot of hats in church ministry. Let them try to teach a class. Let them have leadership roles, different leadership roles on Sunday mornings. Ask them to do things. Don't box them in. Say, I just want you to do this, and that's all you can do. Some churches are like that. They'll say, well, you have a singing gift, so you need to be singing in the worship band or in the choir or something like that. Or they say, you have a teaching gift. You're a teacher at school. You're an educator, so you would make a great teacher also at church. Gen Xers are going to push against that. Oftentimes, one who is a musician will like to use that gift, but will also say, hey, I'd like to try out teaching too. Or try to explore some other gifts that don't tie them into one particular role. So don't box Generation Xers in. Also, Gen Xers will talk a lot about what they call authentic community. Now, that's a really broad term. It's tough to define that. It basically means that they want a group of close friends who experience a lot of life's ups and downs together in a cohesive unit. That's basically what authentic community means. But ironically, what you're going to see, and sometimes baby boomers are very disappointed when they see this happen, their Generation Xers will get very concerned and fired up and energized about creating authentic community in a group, but then they won't show up. Sometimes there's a shyness about Bible study groups and those kinds of things. And so when Gen Xers say they want authentic community, it would be good for baby boomers and millennials to say, well, tell me what that means. Tell me how we can do that. Will you commit to it? That sort of thing. Because sometimes I'll even tell them myself here, sometimes Generation Xers have solutions to problems, but sometimes we're a little hesitant to make that solution happen. So when we say we want authentic community, hold us to that. Help us make it happen. Also, family time is extremely important and is often distinctive from what is called church time. In other words, sometimes we get very upset in churches when we see, for instance, sporting groups that meet on Sundays and have practices and games and that sort of thing. And you say, well, you're disregarding the church. Well, there's probably a lot of truth in that. But the thing is that a lot of Gen Xers see a real distinction between this is my family time, this is my work time, this is my church time, and are very judicious with how they monitor their time in each of those compartments. And so here I would say to Gen Xers that um, it probably would do us a lot of good to sort of keep from this siloed approach and try to interact a little bit more to mix those things on a better, deeper level. Our church-going parents and boomers did this a little bit better than our generation does, where family time and church time were blended together. And so we need to do a better job, I think, as Gen Xers at not siloing our time so much and just saying, well, I'm only going to give church an hour a week, and my family time gets 6 hours, and of course, my job time gets 40 hours or whatever. So, how do we better blend our faith and our Christianity with our family and with our workplace? Also, Generation Xers must be personally invited to do ministry. Don't just say, hey, sign up for this and expect a bunch of Gen Xers to put their name on a page. A lot of times it takes very personal conversation to say, hey, you would do a great job at this. We need you. Again, that fear of failure oftentimes is very hampering for a Gen Xer. And so it's good to say, hey, we need you as a part of this ministry. You need to be creative. We could use you. Can you be a part? Can you help out? Personal invitation means a whole lot. Also, in the church, expect a much less hierarchical approach than boomers took in church life. In other words, the old model of doing church, the pastors at the top, and then you have deacons and Sunday school teachers and committee leaders, and then you go down to the congregational level. A lot of times, Generation Xers want to flip that model upside down, which is actually, if you think about it, a more biblical approach. You have the congregation that's sort of at the top. Jesus is the head, but the congregation is the body, and we all function together. So you're going to see a much less hierarchical approach. Gen Xers are the first to say, well, it's not a big deal that we haven't done it that way before in church. And so sometimes that has led to a lot of bad church fights, right? But some of those fights can be avoided if boomers and millennials looked at Gen Xers and say, what do you think we should do? And when they give you valuable input, say, I've never really thought about that before. That's a cool way of thinking about things. And you try that approach. And you don't box Generation Xers in to one particular institutional model of doing church. Also, for Gen Xers, be aware that two big major things, especially theological things, have caused a lot of confusion in our generation. One is called relativism, and the other is called postmodernism. Let me explain what those are. Those are big words that have simple meanings. Relativism is the idea that every truth claim is relevant, or is relative to another truth claim. In other words, my truth may not be the same as your truth, but we'll just all coexist and get along and tolerate each other. That kind of thinking has caused a lot of problem, a lot of confusion. In fact, Gen Xers have prominently said there's no such thing as absolute truth. Well, the irony in that is then that in saying there's no such thing as truth, you've made an absolute truth claim. And so that can get very confusing. Also, postmodernism is basically the rejection of what have been called Christendom or Christian institutions, a rejection of the church. I really don't need the church. What is the church really? This kind of rejection of all institutions is harmful, and we don't need them anymore. That kind of thing. Everything is uh, uh, patriarchal, and colonial, and all those big words that people use to say we've got it figured out better than you do. Sometimes Generation Xers have a problem with that. But then let's another teaching here that would be very helpful in ministering to Generation Xers is this: make the church a home instead of an institution. Think kitchen and living room especially. What in the world does that mean? Well, what we're talking about there is um, church needs to resemble more of a home, a family unit, than it does uh, a place, a business, an institution that I go to for an hour a week and pay some dues that the church calls tithe, and pay my dues and I go on. How can our churches, be homes, a home away from home, where family gathers on the first day of the week? In fact, if you think about it, that's actually a more biblical approach. Paul talked about the body of Christ. We are the heirs, the adopted sons and daughters of Christ. This family idea is very biblical and very New Testament-ish. And so I would highly advocate, if you want to see more Generation Xers in your church, make the church resemble a family, a home, a house, much more than it does an institution or a business. All right, next week, we're going to talk about millennials. So I hope that you come back next week. Next time on Sunday evenings, we'll post to YouTube and Facebook. And we'll talk about ministering with and to millennials, some cultural traits that we share in common and that we don't share in common with our younger friends, the millennials. Also, we invite you to connect more with our church. You can find us at westoakwoods.com and come over there and see what we've got going on. We've got a new updated calendar on our website that you can see all of our activities and ways that you can become family with us at West Oakwood. So until next time, I'll see you. We're praying for you. If you need anything, please holler at us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.